Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his essay on truth and lying in an extramoral sense, one of the things that Nietzsche is going to talk about towards the middle part and the end that I think a lot of people find confusing is idealism and its contrast or relation to natural law and science. And I think that this notion of natural law, that's a little hazy for a lot of people. But the notion of science as what scientists do, as what we learn in science classes, that I think is fairly straightforward. And natural law was a way that, a lot of people in Nietzsche's time were conceptualizing what it is that science does. Science discovers the natural laws of things. Science is not just about discovering facts or, creating some sort of hypothesis and then, confirming it in terms of a theory or any of that sort of stuff that we teach, particularly to kids in school. Science is really about discovering the natural laws, the regularities that lie behind all of the things that we might call the appearances or the empirical realities that we're encountering. Science reveals to us the insides of the universe, you could say, the guts, and does so, we typically think of it these days, in terms of what can be expressed through mathematics. So we look today, and even in Nietzsche's time, I would say, as physics, a mathematized physics is really being sort of the paradigm, and then we have chemistry, biology, all these other sciences. What is idealism in this discussion then? What does Nietzsche mean? Does he mean sort of a optimism about things? No, it's not that meaning. Does he have in mind a kind of fuzzy-headedness that's different than, concern with empirical reality? No, not exactly. What he has in mind is a philosophical idealism that was often contrasted against a scientific or what we might call positive attitude. And why is he bringing this up at this point? Why is he telling us that, there should be a kind of distrust of this? He says, any person familiar with such meditations has felt a deep distrust for that sort of idealism. And then he connects this with the eternal laws. As often as he has clearly convinced himself of the eternal coherence, omnipresence, and infallibility of the laws of nature. So he's really presenting it almost like a dilemma. Look, either you can have idealism, whatever that's going to mean here, or you can have the laws of nature understood as eternal, immutable, omnipresent. Now notice that he's using divine attribute language here, the language that people used to attribute to God, in part because Nietzsche does think, and this is a somewhat separate topic, that the man of science, the character of the modern era, is really a theologian in disguise. By contrast, the idealism that Nietzsche is talking about here is, in a certain respect, you might say a more, if we want to be a little facetious here, honest approach to the relationship between the subject, the human being, the person who's trying to know things, and the object, the world of things that they're getting to know. So let's backtrack a little bit in the text. Nietzsche tells us that there really is no standard, no criterion for right perception, that is, of empirical reality, of objects. We've seen that earlier in the piece, he's talked about the fact that, even perception itself involves a kind of metaphorical transfer, concept formation, language, all involve this, and then we forget about that. We think that there's regularities that are really socially constructed regularities that we don't treat as such and eventually come to take for granted. So he says that the insect or the bird perceives a completely different world than the human being does, and the question which of these two world perceptions is more right, which is grasping the object, is a completely senseless one. We don't have a standard for that. He says, basically the right perception, that would mean the adequate expression of an object in the subject. And then he says, this seems to me to be a self-contradictory absurdity. Why? Because between the two absolutely different spheres, such as subject and object, Nietzsche says, there can only be an aesthetic relation, a relation of perception, a relation that involves art, that involves metaphor, that involves, you might say, an affective response, not the cold, hard, replicable facts of science, right? Those are really, he's saying, more assumptions than anything else. And so he talks here about the need for some sort of middle sphere. He says, we have a sort of elusive transference going on here, translation into a completely foreign medium. For this, for a freely fictionalizing and freely inventive middle sphere and middle faculty is necessary. So one way of understanding this, which Nietzsche is proposing, is that we do in fact engage in a kind of metaphorical, and he's even going to use the word a little bit later, intuitive approach to this. Another way is that of philosophical idealism, which says that we do in fact, in some sense, construct the universe of objects out there. We are projecting the order, the regularity, in fact, meaning onto being that we find. And this is something that you can get out of Kant, a Kantian idealism. This is something also that you can get in a different way out of Hegel or out of Schopenhauer. Right? So there is an idealist tradition which includes many different viewpoints on this. Fichte as well, he may have in mind here. And the idea is that what we find in the object is what we inject into the object. So he goes on and he says, it's not true that the essence of things appears in the empirical world. And he goes on and says, the relation of a nerve stimulus to a produced picture is not a necessary one. When the same image has been produced millions of times and has been passed on, ultimately appearing to all mankind as a result of the same occasion, in the end it has the same significance as if it were the only necessary image. And so what we've got here, he likens it also to a dream. If we have the same dream over and over and over and over again, we forget that it's a dream. We forget that we are the subject who is, in effect, creating the meaning, creating the regularity, creating the truth there in the side of the object, which is not just an object, but an entire world. A world that we can't empirically grasp as a totality anyway. So he says, coming back to this key point, when we think about this, we should feel a kind of mistrust for that kind of idealism. What's going to allow us to feel that mistrust? When we think instead of this idealism being the case, that we have these laws of nature that we can rely upon. When we view these as coherent, omnipresent, infallible. So he says he drew the conclusion, everything here, as far as we can penetrate, he talks about the telescopic world, which means, and here's a reference to Kant, the starry skies above. Then we have the microscopic world. We can go infinitely large, we can go infinitely small. And we're always going to find these same laws of nature. That's the way in which this mindset, the scientific mindset, approaches matters. We'll always find these laws of nature. They're always going to be the same. So he says, we find these things endlessly, securely, regularly, without gaps. Science will have to dig successfully in these shafts forever. Everything it finds will coincide and not contradict itself. Science will just keep growing and growing and growing and adding more and more data and understanding these laws of nature more and more fully, applying them to different ranges of phenomena, unpacking things. Is that really what happens? That's something we should consider. Does science really work in the way that science tells itself or portrays itself to the populace as working? And the answer is no. But we go on and he says, how little, and he's being ironic here, this resembles a product of fantasy. For if it were that, it would surely betray its illusoriness and unreality at this point. Then he says, well, let's see if that is the case. Against this reasoning, we can say this. And he gives you an argument here about, how perception could be different and how it could change and what that would mean for us. And that no one would talk about regularity of nature, but they would grasp it as a highly subjective formation. They would grasp it the way the idealists were doing. Now, what do we actually find when we think about what science is telling us about the object, when we're looking at this entire world that is supposed to be out there, not merely empirical, but we're grasping it in its nature, in its essence. He says, do we ever really grasp the essences of things? What is a law of nature? Do we know a law of nature? He says, no. It's not known as such, but only in its effects. We're treating it as a kind of cause, according to old schemas of causality, but we don't actually know the cause, we know the effects. Again, it could be pointed out here, Nietzsche is making an analogy, without telling us as such, between what the person of science does and the theologians, who also argued about God based on effects and said we cannot know that ultimate cause in itself only through its relations. And Nietzsche says here, we know the laws of nature through their relations. All these relations refer back only to one another and are absolutely incomprehensible to us in their essence. We add to them things like space, time. What do we have there? Succession in numbers. And Nietzsche says, did you ever stop to think just how strange it is that we are able to mathematize things so well? And he's hinting here that science and the laws of nature, these two interdependent, we could call them activity and concepts, are really a disguised form of idealism. He goes on and he tells us, everything marvelous we admire in the laws of nature and promotes our explanation could mislead us into distrusting idealism, consists exclusively of the mathematical stringency and inviolability of space and time perceptions. But we produce these out of ourselves, which is exactly what the idealists are saying. So in our distrust of idealism, we fall into another kind of idealism, a new mode of idealism that we call non-idealism, positivism, scientific attitudes, all these sorts of wonderful things, and we tell ourselves a false story. So he says, we produce these out of ourselves with the same necessity as a spider spins its web. if we're not compelled to grasp all things only under these forms, then it is not surprising that in all things we really grasp only these forms, for they all must carry the laws of number in themselves, and number is the very thing that's most astonishing about things. And he says, isn't it funny how we find this regularity in the objects, in the stars, in the things that we're observing, and then we also find it in our minds. We say, oh, wonderful, we have an adequation of mind and reality. That's because we put it there in the first place, according to Nietzsche. So what does this mean, then, for science and the laws of nature? Does it mean that we throw it all away and it's no good? No, he's not saying that. But it certainly means that the picture of what's going on in science and with these laws of nature is quite different than what science portrays to itself about its own activity. Or rather, we should say, what the person of science, whether that be the practicing scientist, the apostle of science out there, doing talk shows and videos and podcasts and all that sort of stuff, as a medium, what it is that they're telling themselves and telling everybody else. It's not really a true story, and it really conceals its own form of idealism.